You will hear about the African Union. Yes, it exists. But what is the effect of the African Union in reality?
Oxford University, March 7th, 2:42 p.m. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows of the Sheldonian Theatre, but inside, the air was charged like a sky just before lightning. The hall, packed with scholars, diplomats, and students, had fallen deathly silent. Not because of awe, but because of insult. Professor Cornel West, seated beneath the crest of the university's coat of arms, had just uttered the words that would haunt the institution for decades. Africa has contributed nothing to the foundations of modern civilization. Nothing. His voice echoed with finality, a gavel crashing down on centuries of stolen history. In the front row, a young man slowly closed his notebook. His posture was calm, still, but every breath he drew was a silent drumbeat. He didn't blink.
Sự thù hận vô nghĩa như là nhiều người, thì vị đại úy trẻ giống với cụ Hồ của Việt Nam. Thứ mà ông đeo đuổi, phát nói thì đơn giản, mà thực hiện thì lại là một câu chuyện hoàn toàn khác. Thế giới chúng ta cũng đã gặp quá nhiều chính trị gia.
No one knew his name yet, but something about the stillness in his movement made even the photographers lower their cameras. Then came his reply. Soft, but clear enough to cut through marble. Then I accept your challenge. Gasps. A few phones lifted. A few hearts pounded. What followed would not just be a defense of Africa. It would be a reckoning, a historic rebuttal forged not in anger, but in unshakable truth. And across the continent, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, an entire generation would hear it as a call. This is where the rewriting begins. The moment Ibrahim Traoré accepted the challenge, the entire theater froze, not in disbelief, but in recognition. Something sacred had just been invoked. The silence that followed was not of respect, but anticipation. He stepped toward the podium with the calm precision of a warrior stepping into ritual combat. Not with weapons, but with memory, with truth, with 10,000 years of history pulsing through his veins. Professor Cornel West leaned back, smirking. By all means, he said, folding his arms. Educate us. Traoré opened his folder. Let's begin with numbers, he said. Not ideology, not emotion, just numbers. He raised a photocopy. This is the Lubombo bone, found in Eswatini. It's over 40,000 years old, older than the pyramids, older than Babylon. It contains 29 carved notches, lunar calculations, the first known mathematics on Earth, done in Africa, not Greece, not Rome. A visible discomfort rippled through the room. Or would you prefer philosophy? He continued, pulling out a second document. Zara Jacob, 1600s, Ethiopia. Wrote about rational inquiry, ethics, and universal human dignity, decades before Descartes ever said, I think, therefore I am. His words, I exist because I question. In Ge'ez, an African language. Professor West opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Law? The Ashanti Confederacy had checks and balances centuries before the U.S. Constitution. The Buganda Kingdom held parliamentary sessions under the moon, where no man could speak twice until all voices had been heard. That's democracy, before Europe even knew the word. Gasps, murmurs. Phones began recording. You spoke of civilization as if it were Europe's gift to the world, Traoré said, his voice steady but rising. But in Mali, cataract surgeries were done in the 14th century. In Uganda, the first C-section where both mother and child survived was performed in 1879, 50 years before your textbooks admit. He turned to the crowd. This isn't about ego. This is about erasure. We're not asking for credit. We're demanding the truth. From Timbuktu's 700,000 manuscripts to the metallurgy of the Haya people of Tanzania, Africa was and is a cradle of brilliance. The audience, students, professors, even security guards were now leaning forward, eyes wide. When we say Ubuntu, Traoré said, placing his hand on his chest, we mean I am because we are. That's not tribal folklore. That's a political philosophy of collective responsibility, of dignity, of justice. The very things your institutions claim to teach but refuse to learn. He stepped back from the mic. If you believe in truth, then share this. Post it. Teach it. Speak it. Let your children know that Africa did not wait for permission to be great. And then, looking directly into the camera, subscribe if you care about truth. Like if you believe history belongs to all of us. Share this if you're tired of silence being the only answer. Because today wasn't just a lecture. It was the first tremor of a cultural earthquake. For a full 15 seconds, Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. He stood before 500 scholars, diplomats, and students, all holding their breath in that ancient chamber of learning. The same walls that had echoed with the voices of empire now held their silence for a man from Ouagadougou dressed in a simple black suit. He didn't flare his nostrils. He didn't clench his fists. Instead, he closed his eyes. And in that quiet, he remembered the faces of elders in Bobo Lasso, reciting proverbs under baobab trees. He recalled the call to prayer rising over the hills of Gorée, the manuscripts of Djenné, and the scent of the dust where his ancestors once forged iron with their bare hands. He thought of the children in Burkina Faso, learning history from books that spoke of Rome and London, but never of Sankor, or Zara Yaqub, or Ahmed Baba. And then, slowly, he opened his eyes. "I won't argue," he said quietly. "I'll reveal." A simple sentence, but it shifted the air in the room. He opened his folder, not to attack, but to lay bare. Gently, he placed a page on the lectern. "This," he said, "is from the Ishango bone. Found in the Congo, over 20,000 years old. Prime numbers, division, multiplication, long before Pythagoras drew his first breath." Still no applause, just reverent silence. He turned another page. Here is a record of the cataract surgeries performed in 14th century Mali. Not myths. Medical journals written in Arabic and Songhai. While Europe still bled its sick, our healers were restoring sight. He paused. "I don't speak today because I want to. I speak because silence is no longer a choice." He stepped aside, letting the documents speak for themselves. One showed the constitutional balance of the Ashanti Confederacy, 3 centuries before the U.S. Constitution. Another depicted the stone-carved churches of Lalibela, built down into the earth with such precision that modern engineers still marvel. He described how the Haya people of Tanzania developed carbon steel in furnaces 2,000 years ago. How the Dogon charted Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye. How women in Uganda performed the first successful cesarean section where both mother and child survived, using banana wine and handmade instruments in 1879. With each revelation, Traoré did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His restraint was thunderous. His calm was a weapon. And in that theater soaked in centuries of selective memory, he became something more than a speaker. He became memory itself, restored, unchained, undeniable. By the time he looked up again, Professor Cornell West was no longer smiling. The audience, once slouched and skeptical, now sat straight, pens moving, eyes wide. No one interrupted. They knew somehow that history was being reclaimed, not with fire, but with truth wrapped in dignity. And it had just begun. Just when the audience thought Ibrahim Traoré had finished, he did something no one, neither critics nor admirers, had foreseen. He stepped down from the podium and walked directly toward Professor Cornell West. The room stiffened. Even the air paused. Face to face, barely 2 feet apart, Traoré held out a thick leather envelope. "Inside," he said quietly, "are translated excerpts from 43 manuscripts housed in Timbuktu. Subjects: astronomy, medicine, ethics, law, most over 500 years old, each one peer-reviewed by contemporary African scholars. I've taken the liberty of having your department's seal embossed on the folder. You may find it familiar. Your predecessors once claimed these as curiosities. They are, in fact, blueprints of civilization." He placed the folder gently on West's desk. Then, without stepping back, Traoré reached into his jacket and withdrew a stone. Small, smooth, reddish-brown. This is laterite, common in West Africa. But when carved with geometric precision, it forms the interlocking blocks of Great Zimbabwe, built without mortar. structures so advanced that early European explorers insisted they had to be Phoenician. Because how could Africans build greatness without permission? He turned to the audience now, holding the stone high. "This isn't just stone," he said. "It's memory. It's evidence. It's indictment." A stunned murmur swept through the hall. Phones were no longer just recording. They were shaking in hands. But Traoré wasn't done. He walked over to the projection screen. "Let's try something Oxford might understand. Data." With one swift motion, he connected his USB drive and lit up the theater with a slide titled, "African Innovations Suppressed or Claimed by Colonial Academia." Charts, names, patents, and erased histories filled the screen, showing everything from surgical tools in Ethiopia to fractal-based city planning by the Ba-Ila people of Zambia. Gasps. Audible disbelief. Then, in a voice that somehow grew even steadier, "We didn't come here for revenge," he said. "We came for restoration." He clicked again. A photo appeared. Young children in a Burkinabe village, seated on the floor, reading books in Dioula and Moure, languages once outlawed under French colonial rule. They deserve to see themselves in history, not as footnotes to European glory, but as authors of their own brilliance. That was the moment. Not a word from Cornell West, not a breath from the crowd. Because in those few minutes, Traoré hadn't just countered an argument. He had shifted the battlefield entirely. He redefined what it meant to win, not through domination, but by making truth undeniable. And in that act, stone, manuscript, image, he didn't just reclaim Africa's past. He forced the world to face it. What began as a moment of resistance within Oxford's ivory walls quickly unraveled into something far greater than anyone had imagined. By the time Traoré stepped off the stage, a dozen videos of his speech were already spreading across campus group chats. Within hours, they had gone viral, first in Accra, then Nairobi, then Johannesburg. By morning, they were trending in Lagos, Kinshasa, and Addis Ababa. In Dakar, a group of students projected his image on the wall of the Cheikh Anta Diop University, chanting in unison, "Nous sommes la mémoire, nous sommes la vérité." We are memory, we are truth. In Windhoek, professors held an emergency meeting at the University of Namibia, proposing a full audit of their colonial-era curriculum. And in Kigali, President Ndize opened a televised cabinet meeting by quoting Traoré's line, "We didn't come for revenge, we came for restoration." News anchors from Nairobi to New York scrambled to cover the Oxford uprising. Western academics, some embarrassed, others newly awakened, issued public statements of support. A few offered retractions of long-standing theories, but perhaps the most unexpected response came from an unlikely place: the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. The chairperson, in a rare midnight session, proposed the establishment of a Continental Heritage Institute to fund the translation, preservation, and repatriation of African manuscripts held in Western archives. "Our knowledge is not lost," she declared. "It is imprisoned. We must bring it home." In Burkina Faso, school children watched the replay of their president's speech in packed classrooms. Elders wept quietly, whispering the names of ancestors erased from textbooks. Local radio stations in Ouagadougou switched to broadcasting historical essays in Mour and Dioula. Griots, traditional oral historians, held gatherings, recounting tales once forced into silence. And beyond the continent, something else began to shift. At the Sorbonne, African students draped a banner from the main gate. "Africa is not a shadow of Europe, it is its own sun." At Columbia University, Black graduate students petitioned for African philosophy to be included as core curriculum. In São Paulo, Rio, Port-au-Prince, descendants of the African diaspora found themselves standing taller, speaking louder. Even in Oxford, something broke open. Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies, stood before a packed lecture hall days later and said, "For too long, we've treated African history as a sidebar. Mr. Traoré reminded us it is, in fact, the preface." What had begun as a single voice of calm defiance became a chorus, resonating across cities, borders, and languages. And for the first time in generations, young Africans were not just reacting to history, they were reclaiming it, they were writing it, and the world was finally listening. Months passed, but the echoes of that March afternoon in Oxford did not fade. They matured, like seeds falling into long-forgotten soil, finally touched by rain. What Traoré began was no longer just a moment of defiance. It had become a movement of rebuilding. In Burkina Faso, the government partnered with traditional griots and modern archivists to launch the House of Memory, a national center where oral traditions, manuscripts, and indigenous sciences were digitized and taught to students from every province. Murals of Zara Yaqub and Queen Nzinga replaced colonial statues in public squares. In Nigeria, the University of Ibadan opened a new department dedicated to African engineering history, tracing innovations from knock metallurgy to Sahelian irrigation systems. For the first time, children were solving equations based on Dogon astronomy, not just Newtonian physics. Rural communities from Lesotho to Senegal began holding Ubuntu days, where elders shared ancestral wisdom and children debated in local languages. Schools swapped imported history books for bilingual texts, written by African scholars, illustrated by local artists, and rooted in the soil their students walked on. But it wasn't just education that changed. A cultural renaissance bloomed. Young musicians sampled rhythms of the djembe and kora with futuristic beats, calling it neo-heritage. Filmmakers in Nairobi and Harare adapted Traoré's speech into animated shorts and documentaries for school curriculums. Poetry nights across the continent now opened with the line, "We didn't come for revenge, we came for restoration." Even the African diaspora began tracing their heritage with new eyes. From Harlem to Haiti, Black communities rediscovered Timbuktu, the pyramids of Meroe, the logic of Ubuntu, not as myths, but as blueprints for resilience. And in Oxford itself, something extraordinary happened. The Sheldonian Theatre, once a fortress of colonial thought, became the site of an annual event. The Ibrahim Traoré Lecture on Global Truth and Restorative Knowledge. Its first student speaker? A 19-year-old girl from Bamako, who quoted her grandmother and said, "We are the descendants of erased kings and unwritten queens, but we will no longer live unnamed." When Traoré returned a year later, he didn't speak from the stage. He sat in the audience listening, smiling, because the work was no longer his alone. It belonged to millions now. A truth once buried beneath centuries of silence had risen, and it would not go quietly again. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of who we are and where we come from, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to keep learning, like to lift these voices higher. Share to make sure no child ever grows up believing Africa began with chains. Africa began with light. And now, the world sees it. Conclusion. The echo that never died. When the world first heard Ibrahim Traoré speak in that hallowed hall of Oxford, many assumed it would be a viral moment, a sharp spike of outrage, a few headlines, and then silence once more. But they underestimated what happens when truth finds its voice after centuries of being silenced. What Traoré delivered wasn't simply a rebuttal. It was a reckoning, a reclaiming, a restoration. He didn't need theatrics, he didn't insult. He simply held up a mirror, etched with centuries of African achievement, and made one of the most powerful institutions in the Western world look itself in the eye. In that quiet, deliberate confrontation, he shattered more than just a lecture. He fractured a centuries-old narrative that had painted Africa as passive, primitive, and peripheral. And in its place, he revealed something far older and far truer, a continent that gave birth to stars, to mathematics, to architecture, to law, to healing, to music, to soul. From the carved stones of Great Zimbabwe to the manuscripts of Timbuktu, from the fractal cities of the Ba-Ila to the spiritual philosophy of Ubuntu, Africa was never waiting to be discovered. It was always the beginning. What makes Traoré's stand so unforgettable is not just what he said, but how he said it. Not with anger, but with grace. Not with vengeance, but with vision. His composure made every fact hit harder. His calm made every revelation undeniable. And more importantly, he did not claim this knowledge for himself. He offered it back to the people it had always belonged to the children in Ouagadougou who now learned their ancestors were not conquered savages, but scientists, To the girls in Kampala, who no longer feel invisible in philosophy class. To the elders in Dakar, who recognize their own proverbs being honored on global stages. To the diaspora in New York, Paris, and Rio, finally hearing the names that were once stolen from their tongues. This wasn't just about correcting the past. It was about healing the future. In a world fractured by colonial amnesia, Traoré reminded us that dignity is not granted. It is remembered. And when memory returns, it does not whisper. It roars. Now, classrooms echo with names once erased. Curricula shift. Archives open. Flags rise not to divide, but to honor where we all began. Because the question is no longer, what did Africa contribute? The question is now, how did we ever believe it didn't? And so, as the sun sets on centuries of distortion, a new dawn rises. Not just for Africa, but for truth itself. Let this not be the end of the conversation, but the first chapter of a new story. One written in full light. One spoken in every language, and one that no one, ever again, can silence.